So we will make some reorganization, and the first lecture, as you know, you all got agenda, you all have already registered at Moodle, so all of the professors, as you know, will upload their PowerPoint presentations. We have already uploaded some relevant books, but we will add additional reading materials for you. And tonight we have this first course, the theoretical one, called Feminist Political and Legal Theories. As you very well know, our distinguished professors, Professor Miodrag Jovanović and Professor Bojan Spajić, but I will have the pleasure to give the first, maybe most theoretical lecture this evening. So the title is Feminist Reconsideration of Mainstream Political Theories and Relevant Political Concepts. A few introductory remarks. Patriarchy represented throughout all pre-modern societies the dominant model of social relations and dominant system of values characterized by hierarchy, power relations, subordination of women. Modernity introduced tendencies of political emancipation, process of establishing universal rights, including women's rights, and opened horizons of equality for women. It happened under the impact of political revolutions and the Industrial Revolution of 18th, 19th century, and other accompanying factors. As mentioned before, horizons of women's equality were opened in principle, not so much in reality. The long struggle for women's rights was necessary in that regard. Women's rights had been invisible in the US Declaration of Independence, and the long period from 1776 up to 1920 was needed in the USA for affirming or adopting equal rights to vote. So it means 154 years. And the same is valid for the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Namely, France needed from the French Revolution and this very well-known declaration a long period of time for recognizing the equal right to vote from 1789 to 1944. So 165 years, believe or not. Modern and contemporary times have not eliminated patriarchal legacy, but crucial change has happened between pre-modern times and modernity in a sense that patriarchy has lost its previous dominance and exclusivity. The dialectic of patriarchy and emancipation has been established with modernity. So not only the dominance of patriarchy, but these controversial civilizational tendencies come on agenda. In contemporary times, does exist a contradictory crossing of patriarchy and emancipation from patriarchy, meaning the so-called dialectic of patriarchy and anti-patriarchy within all spheres of life, starting from the individual person and personal life and family life, including all domains of the public life of the individuals, social groups and institutions, including all spheres of knowledge and the political and legal thought. So that's the framework, methodological, theoretical framework. Now, to switch fast and shortly to speak about the lack of gender-sensitive approach in contemporary mainstream political theories. The contemporary conservative, extreme right-wing, populist, even neoliberal political theories openly or tacitly affirm patriarchy, a patriarchal system of values in traditional family roles with the subordination of women, a strict division of the private and public life in a traditional sense of words, or in other words, upon the patriarchal axis. It is a logical consequence of their political character. In the case of conservatism and populism, authoritarian collectivist ideas prevail. In the case of neoliberalism, individualist and competition-oriented ideas and practices lead in their particular way towards an emerging of the so-called new patriarchy. It does not mean, of course, that certain elements of political emancipation have not been or could not also be incorporated in these contemporary theories. So just not forget that this dialectic of patriarchy and contrary to patriarchy, emancipatory elements has been everywhere on agenda. However, the patriarchal element of the dominant so-called dialectic of patriarchy and emancipation affects also the contemporary political and legal theories of human rights, constitutional democracy, international law of human rights, theories of justice, egalitarian liberalism, and social democratic theories. So there is the problem. Why, how? And I will consider that a little bit. Contemporary theories of human rights most often forget, ignore, and neglect women's rights and issues of gender equality. Also, contemporary theories of justice, Rawls, Dworkin, McIntyre, Ackerman, etc., most often keep women outside their conceptions of justice, either by locating women in the family with uncontested traditional family structure included, or conceived, taken as included, or by ignoring family as a matter of justice, or by making women invisible in the universal abstract categories of person, individual, human being, which hide most often male stream understanding of justice, male domination, a male design of and understanding of the concepts. Within the same logic of forgettedness on one hand, and the same framework of promoting abstract categories of person, human being, universal rights on another, there are by rule put aside intersectional dimensions of gender inequality, discrimination and oppression based simultaneously on gender, race, class, culture, as well as the non-binary and transgender queer individuals and their context and living condition of life and living conditions. So the question is, why do the most progressive contemporary theories, these prior to this mentioned theories, those oriented towards highest civilizational standards of universal human rights and constitutional principles, also omit the gender equality approach? So the response is really not easy, and I'm not able to give a complete and a very convincing response. However, just a few remarks in that regard. It is linked to a kind of automatism that contemporary political thinkers, including those who deal with constitutional theories of human rights, that follow the track of the dominant legacy, the mainstream thought. So it happens that the mentioned progressive contemporary theories with their critical thinking against different sources of inequalities, injustices, paradoxically stand uncritical, non-reflexive towards gender inequalities and an importance of gender issue. Feminist critique assumes that modern and contemporary political and legal theories have kept almost automatically, as I already said, allegedly neutral political concepts from the grand theories, which hide power relations, subordination, and invisibility of women inherited from patriarchy. In addition, the whole liberal tradition, including the so-called egalitarian liberalism of the nowadays, and including liberal theories of justice, have had the deep conceptual problem with each substantive understanding of identities, gender identity, national identity, social identity, so the whole liberal tradition, and insofar opt for abstract universalist, categorist, abstract citizen, and the others which I already mentioned. Besides all mentioned, it might sometimes be also a matter of the personal lack of awareness and biased mindsets of the prominent scholars in regards of gender equality issue, also in the case of the theoreticians of constitutional democracy, theories of human rights, etc. An overcoming of deeply rooted patriarchal mindsets requires clear awareness and attempts, so new critical reconsidering of these progressive critical theories, and attempts towards gender mainstreaming of the political thought. This gender mainstreaming happens mostly under an impact of the postmodern feminist political and legal theories. So it does not happen spontaneously, or usually does not happen just like that. But this attempt coming from the feminist critiques means the crucial impact. So concerning the feminist critique of the mainstream theories, feminist streams of critical thought have aimed over, I always speak in plural, have aimed over the past 60 years at deconstructing the so-called universal categories of political thought, pointing to the fact that these allegedly universal categories have been hiding, reproducing power relations and male dominance of male, white, upper-class property owners. The second wave feminism made a certain contribution with this deep deconstructing process, but probably a smaller one than the third wave feminism. There were sound attempts of the second wave done by Carol Pateman, for example, who pointed to the sexual contract, the contractual character of modern patriarchy within the family as the basis of the social contract in public life. So it was her response to social contract political theories, which simply put aside, ignore the family, the private domain, and which she calls social contract, and power based on power imbalances. Also, the so-called radical feminists from 60s and 70s focused on deconstructing patriarchal power relations between women and men. However, these attempts did not extend over the critical approach of Western feminists towards patriarchy and gender inequality issues, as expressed in the framework of developed Western liberal democratic societies, the time of new social movements in 1960s in the Western world, with the huge intensive rise of new social movements, the feminist movement, and feminist thought. The mentioned West-centric approaches did pretend to be universally valid, but were obviously limited in their scope and comprehension. Third wave feminisms were inspired by postmodern political theories, critical race theories, critical legal studies as well. This new wave of feminism, or feminisms, put an accent since 1980s on overcoming the West-centric feminist approaches of the white, middle, and upper-class feminist authors, and topics and issues of their consideration framed by the Western experiences and articulations. Namely, the postmodern feminists started requiring the inclusion of different gender perspectives and issues in political and legal discourses, namely those related to women of color, so different races, different social classes, different sexualities, so expanding the topics of relevance for this whole discourse. Third wave feminisms have tended, in line with the postmodern criticism of mainstream political theories, to overcome the universalism of abstract concepts within mainstream political theories, but still keep on a specific focus on the paradigm of patriarchy. The difference in comparison with the mainstream political theories, but also in comparison with the feminist theories of the already mentioned second wave of feminist thought comes from considering the patriarchy never again, not still as something granted, given as such, universally valid, as a universalist and generalized phenomenon, how it had been considered within the second wave of feminism, which, as I already said, essentially reduced the whole context and discourse to the West-centric analysis. The postmodern feminism or feminisms use the concept of patriarchy in a historical and comparativist perspective and attuned to the cultural specificity of different societies and periods and to that of different groups within societies and periods. Then what I add to this context and switch in the framework of analysis. So in my opinion, postmodern feminist thinkers often forget the mentioned dialectic of patriarchy and emancipation, and they should not forget it, because the modern and contemporary world has been characterized with mutual crossing of these contradictory civilizational tendencies. It is important, thusly, to have in mind the mentioned dialectic in the mentioned concrete historical comparativist intersectionalist analysis of gender inequalities in different societies, cultures, political orders, social groups nowadays. So not only to be focused on comparativist, intersectionalist, historical, genealogical analysis of patriarchy, but patriarchy versus emancipation. That really is crucial for the most, for the optimal framework of analysis. So about the old and new political concepts in feminist political theories. The feminist transformation of the main political categories leads towards compromising the universality of the ideals and delegitimizing of male power within all political categories of justice, equality, freedom, rights, democracy, etc. Feminist theories deconstruct the mainstream, also called male-streamed, political and legal concepts and conceptions, and point to the necessity of overcoming power relations and male dominance hidden in these categories as well as in all spheres of the real life. The key achievement of feminist political and legal theories is changing the meaning of all political categories and including new categories into the political domain of politics as the practice of politics and domain of political thinking. But now in our focus is political thinking. Relevant for feminist understanding of the domain of the political become concepts of family, sexuality, care, persuasion, patriarchy, violence, pornography, prostitution, sex trafficking, sexual harassment, modern slavery, gender division of labor, privacy and care, all of which are considered as non-political issues by mainstream theory or theories. The new political concepts or the feminist understanding of these concepts, and in that context, considering them as new. So the new political concepts, care, community, family, and privacy, in their interplay with the old political concepts of democracy, power, justice, contribute to revising the meaning of the old ones' concepts as well. So to this concept, democracy, power, justice, and I will mention some others in the forthcoming analysis. Care, as the notion at the heart of the private-public split, has the potential for breaking with the dichotomy which has been has been the feature of the mainstream or traditional or the current political theories. So this differentiation between private and public domain. So care brings potential for treating the private sphere not only as a matter of family concern, but also as a political concept that forces a fundamental reorientation of politics towards the question of building a good political order. And caring as a political notion implies a significant reorientation of politics towards the common good. Community used to be considered the backdrop for politics, but not politics per se for most of political theories in that traditional framework, with an exception of the communitarian mainstream political theories. However, feminists refuse the identitarian definition of community, which is existent in many or most communitarian political theories nowadays, which bears the controversial potential for collectivist oppression of individual needs and choices, especially with regard to the negative impacts of different forms of patriarchal subordination of women within different cultural, ethnic, and religious identities. So feminism incorporates the notion of category of community, but in a different way, not to be reduced to this identitarian collectivist approach, which again covers power relations and subordination of women determined either by race, class, religion, cultural habits, etc. So feminists emphasize the importance of the community as a process of developing mutual relations of care, of negotiating about the common good, being in common, fostering a sense of belonging, and taking care in political terms. And now in the follow-up and in the connection with these new concepts and new meanings which they contribute, let us speak a little bit about new meanings of the old political concepts. Equality is no longer only formal equality, but also a pledge for a substantive equality. This, of course, does not fit only for feminist theories, but here that is our focus, so a little bit, simplified approach is here on agenda. In the case of postmodern feminist theories, this attempt develops as the pledge for a substantial equality, which, again, substantial equality is not only within the discourse of feminist theory, but here, within the feminist discourse, it gains the meaning of and approach of intersectionality, which connects equality with the recognition of differences in a sense of different needs of women of different classes and races, and belonging to different social groups, different parts of the world, etc., etc. So that's intersectional meaning of substantive equality in the feminist discourse. Inclusive democratic order is proposed with a progressive welfare policy and health care. This also does not fit only for feminist theories, but in their case encompasses also a pledge for an equal access to reproductive rights for women from all classes and races. Justice has to include gender justice, overcoming patriarchy in family and public life, sharing responsibilities and obligations, and redistribution of resources focused equally on women. We remember what was said about theories of justice and most often putting aside the family, and if taking the family into consideration, then doing that with the traditional family structure being considered. So democratic theory has to take into consideration power relations in the private domain of the family as the ones that support domination in the public sphere and vice versa. The battle against domination cannot be restricted to governments, institutions, but must also include the family and private sphere as well as individuals. In short, the existing notions are thoroughly revised, beginning with privacy, freedom, individuality, collectivity, equality, democracy, justice, and citizenship. Here I will speak a little bit more, or especially concerning private, public, and the notion of privacy, but also will speak about the concept of democracy. Contribution of feminist theories for the mainstream theories of democracies can be summed up in the following. So democracy was reconsidered by the second wave of feminism in the late 1960s, mostly in relation to Western world, changed conceptions of power, individualism, collectivity, community, collaboration, and persuasion. Feminists at that time established the notion of women's culture as distinct from that of male participants in new social movements of 1960s, in the sense that this culture emphasized connection and relationship over individualism and rights, that this culture relied on collaboration and persuasion and on creating power with others instead of imposing it through sanctions or force. The idea built through the mentioned feminist practice was that political power should not be only the power of coercion. So new social movements, feminist movements, female, male participants, and then female participants who also, and not only them, but mostly they started developing feminist theories and feminist critique, and then also witnessed the, how to say, patriarchal manners of their colleagues taking part in new social movements, including the feminist ones, and from there they started thinking about the difference in the inherited culture, women's culture, as to make the difference towards the patriarchal culture adopted by their colleagues, students, and members of new social movements, male participants. Debates from 1970s within the mainstream democratic theory and practice of constitutional democracy and under the influence of multiculturalism and feminist movements led towards requirements for more inclusive democratic thought and democratic order. Namely, the global pyramid of center-periphery, subordination of nations, classes, and races has come into focus and makes more clear the facts about the additional subordination of all groups of women within the global pyramid, depending on the concrete intersectional oppression experienced in their nation, state, ethnic group, race, class, and family. That was also the political historical framework of the birth of postmodern feminisms. The direct theoretical impact for articulating postmodern feminisms came, however, from postmodern political theories. The third wave postmodern feminisms reconsidered again in 1980s the concepts of democracy and other political concepts. African American feminists, international feminists, and postmodern feminists revised additionally the concept of democracy with an attempt to overcome the Western-centric tendency in any democracy for members of a dominant group to assume the needs and perceptions of subordinates. It implies requirements for much more inclusive conception of democracy. So not to speak in the name. So contemporary theories of democracy is coming from the Western countries, from the Western authors, not to speak in the name, not to pretend to be universally valid, and to speak in the name of all other nations, social groups, female social groups differentiated on the basis of race, class, culture, etc. But so a more inclusive conception of democracy is demanded. In addition, so they criticized the white Western middle class centered feminism of the second wave. So this new third wave feminisms also criticize the second wave, West-centered, white, middle-class feminists as the authors and as the legacy. They criticize the white, Western, middle-class centered feminism of the second wave, which neglects the global context of subordination with special impact on women. The rise of the LGBT struggle for recognition also appeared on agenda. In that context, feminists and LGBTQR plus groups have struggled for different multiple gender and transgender identities to be recognized. Feminist and LGBT groups, though, also sometimes come into mutual conflicts, but these whole new emerging fields of relevance put pressure, and the third feminism's different streams of third feminism try to incorporate them. Some with taking well or enough into consideration the issues of non-binary, non-heteronormative peoples, and the others less, but all of that come on agenda. Contemporary democracies use a deliberative approach, generally speaking, a model of deliberative democracy. A mixture of coercive power, threat of sanctions and force, and persuasion. So persuasion in deliberative conceptions of democracy is included, which is different from, persuasion, which is different from manipulation, which means presenting reasons, communicating on common goals, and using a mixture of knowledge and emotion. Feminist insights related to the specific female culture of care and giving are used for advancing deliberative democracy by means of giving a greater role to persuasion. So to advancing, improving the conceptions, the mainstream conceptions of deliberative democracy. Advancing of theory of democratic persuasion and deliberative democracy in the content of feminist critique, postmodern feminisms, is led by female experiences of connection and care, which come out from women's historical position of powerlessness. The concept of power as an empowerment, those powerless who have to develop their own, how to say, skills of persuasion in order to survive. But the concept of power as an empowerment of powerless emerges as an alternative to the masculine view of power as domination. Feminist scholars also assume that theory and practice of democratic deliberation would be significantly improved by something else, by making deliberation less hierarchical and more interactive and listening-oriented. It would allow for the recognition of needs and interests of disadvantaged social groups, listening to their problems, and allow for more inclusive public space for their political participation, empowering those vulnerable ones. It would lead to the reconstruction of democratic power based on the insights. It would lead to the reconstruction of democratic power based on the insights of connection. Feminists point to the fact that the issue of ongoing relationships, listening, empathy, and emotional commitment are as yet underdeveloped in democratic theory, and they push forwards in advancing democratic theories in that regard. Besides the mentioned feminist contributions to advancing deliberative democracy through putting more accent on a non-hierarchical persuasion, there are also the ones related to combining the cognitive right-based approach and emotional storytelling approach in democratic deliberation and persuasion. Feminist authors point to an importance for democratic theory and practice to combine effective relationship-based and connection-oriented approach with a cognitive, right-based, individual-oriented approach. In other words, democratic theory, deliberative democracy should combine emotional, storytelling approach, open for empathy, community, collectivity, for a priority of the common good, and for power, considered as empowerment on the one hand, and the approach related to rational acknowledging of democratic ideals on another. And this feminist deconstructing and reconstructing the private-public dichotomy and giving the new meaning to the private domain. You will see that's a rather complex analysis with different dimensions. So private is political was the slogan of the radical feminists of 1960s, of the new social movements. But the dichotomy between private and public has become a general feminist issue in the postmodern feminist theories. Feminists do not neglect the privacy as such, but uncover the background of the so-called private sphere of patriarchal family and subordinated female roles within that type of the family. Feminist critique showed that what had been considered the private realm was saturated with unequal power relations. The household was structured by gender hierarchies, domination, and inequalities. The traditional division of private and public, where state intervention had been or still has been considered illegitimate in the private. So illegitimate state does not have to do anything with private issues, has had long-term and serious, sometimes deadly consequences for women, victims, survivors or not survivors of men's violence. Namely, considering as the private family matters such as marital rape, sexual violence, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, and other forms of violence against women, had given them legitimation for the long pre-modern history, and differently, but always with huge harm for women, so throughout the long patriarchal history. The private sphere should not be neglected and deleted but reconstructed. Some dimensions related to personal autonomy should persist as the private domain as feminist critiques pledge. Women's legitimate privacy should be essentially different from the patriarchal privacy associated with female repression. It should provide women with opportunities for individual forms of privacy and private choices and individual freedom to be left alone. Women of all classes and races should have right to privacy in terms of the control over their personal needs, space, time, opportunity to be left alone, to be independent, as well as in terms of the right to abortion and the whole complex of reproductive rights. Women of all races and classes should have right to privacy and individual freedom to be left alone under conditions of an inclusive democratic order with progressive welfare policies and health care and equal access to reproductive rights regardless of their racial and social economic status. However, as already mentioned, what had been considered as private but with causing a great harm to women's rights, body, sexuality, harassment, sexual family violence, genital mutilation, forced marriages, must be controlled, as well as child custody and divorce issues, must be controlled by the state social policy, political, social, and police state authorities. So different aspects of private is political or of this right to privacy or the issue of privacy in the feminist theory. Connection with human rights discourse. The right to privacy and equal rights are interconnected in regards of equal access to abortion, reproductive rights. The right to privacy has to be linked to the discourse of human rights, civil rights, and the demand for racial and sexual equality. The right to privacy has to be unrestricted on one hand by the state in terms of the right to abortion, contraception, sexual identity, but supported by welfare state measures with a commitment to racial, sexual, and economic equality. Responsibilities of the state coming out from this new approach to privacy and private-public dichotomy. Right to abortion and reproductive rights require active and affirmative state intervention, but not an interventionist state. It means the state that allows equal access while respecting the individual right to choice. It means a more inclusive democratic state and its intersectional approach in policy making, the state which cares about poor women and women of color with a well-ordered healthcare social welfare system. In short, the right to privacy demands welfare state policies. Meaning that some authors speak about, it's not enough to speak about the right to abortion as the women's individual right, because if all women of all classes, races, poor women do not have an access to abortion, meaning if the state welfare policies do not protect reproductive rights for all women and taken together, then right to abortion is just something what is declaratively there as the right. So it cannot be conducted, implemented. So many women cannot afford themselves right to abortion. The expression personal is political emphasizes that issues that were considered women's personal issues have been in fact political issues and in need of political intervention to generate change. Such issues include, for example, sexuality, reproduction, birth control, child care, housework, bodily integrity, and intimate partner violence. Domestic violence and sexual harassment are no longer private issues, but a responsibility of the state. Prevention of, protection from, and sanctioning of gender-based violence has become a public matter, the matter of international and domestic law. On the other hand, so it really is complex, the protection of reproductive rights has to be essentially depoliticized. And I mentioned that in one sense previously. So this depolitization, what it means, there is no space for putting these rights into question by any governments in any process, independently from how democratic that process could be. The state simply has the obligation to protect these rights and to contribute to their affirmation by the social policy measures, as well as the protection against violence. It cannot be private issue, private matter, what happens within the family with harassment rate, etc. Also important, but very shortly in this private-public dichotomy and domain. The family as a private domain is no longer limited to women. Women and men should share family and work obligations. Also in cases of non-binary families, patriarchal social roles have to be overcome and equal share of obligations should be the standard. And the type of family relations and roles, whether patriarchal or democratic, directly affect, it also has to be how private domain is important and is not only private in political, in terms of the domain of political. The type of family relations and roles, whether patriarchal or democratic, directly affect the type of personalities that emerge from families because of particular child rearing and reproduce social roles and systems of values learned through the upbringing of kids in the family and at school. They also directly affect distribution of activities in public life, as well as political culture and political affiliations, whether for a democratic or authoritarian political order. So, just shortly to add something about critical feminist legal thought, which comes into some crossing with feminist political theories, but still has some specificities, which I will mention. So legal feminism of the second half of the 20th century explicitly critically addresses the male orientation of law. Feminist analysis of law negatively taken is negatively an analysis of how some or all women have been excluded from the design of the legal system or the application of law, and positively a normative argument about how, if at all, women's inclusion can be accomplished. Feminist legal scholars criticize the so-called impartiality and objectivity of legal systems, uncovering the male standards and assumptions that permeate these concepts. McKinnon, for instance, argues that ideals such as objectivity and neutrality, which are typical of Western legal culture, are actually masculine values that have been taken as universal values. Thus, the law is male, meaning that when a woman stands before the law applies fundamentally masculine criteria. Feminist legal scholars highlight the male standards for defining the reasonable person and how these standards mask male construct and thereby consolidate male dominance. Feminist legal scholars have the central focus on the issue of equality and substantive equality and on implementing gender equality in legal theory and practice, then on the issue of discrimination, oppression, and the issue of the private-public dichotomy again, as the political theories. Aristotle's principle of procedural justice, equality for equals, inequality for unequals, was taken as the critical starting point for considering what equality requires against a patriarchal legal background. However, equality for equals hides always again through the legal history, through those differently in different contexts, as feminist legal critiques assume, inequality of women within the framework of what was the meaning of legal subject, who was considered equal legal subject. With the regard to equality diversity pair, legal feminists elaborated subtle analysis of the alternatives between formal and substantive equality, but also further elaborated the concept of substantive equality in terms of equality of opportunity, equality of results or outcomes, equality of condition, equality of power, and social equivalence. And even more further, argued for an intersectional approach, which I already mentioned, in order to better articulate matching between universal equality and struggle for recognition of differences applied on women of different classes, races, color, what means matching between universal equality and acknowledging gender-based intersectional discrimination and oppression. Gender equality has been defined in three ways within legal thought, critical legal thought, feminist thought: sameness, difference, and transformation. Sameness, equality means equal treatment. This leads to understanding equality as equal opportunity and resonates with the liberal feminist vision of equality. Difference, equal valuation of different contributions. The transformation approach to gender equality does not focus on the extent to which men and women are the same or not, but rather on the social, political, and economic systems and forces that enable or not change. Instead of comparing contributions, the focus is on differences, the focus is on the transformation of structures that can cause change and transform gender inequality. In that line, also a very famous critical legal theoretician, Sandra Fredman, speaks about 4 steps which are needed for achieving substantive equality within legal theory and legal practice. First, to redress inequality, disadvantage. Second, to address stigma, prejudice, stereotyping, humiliation, and violence. Third, to initiate institutional transformation. And fourth, to accommodate, so transformation, we have already mentioned that, the transforming approach, active approach of feminist legal theories. And fourth, to accommodate difference, stimulating inclusion, empowerment of women, pushing them to take part, to be active in political life, in the legal sphere of decision making, etc. In legal analysis, the discussion on equality goes beyond the alternative between what is same and what is different. It requires that male domination be uncovered and balanced by constructing a legal standard that takes into account the perspective of women and their possibilities to act in society. Equality here becomes almost a function of empowerment. So transformation, transformative action, proactive approach. Feminist critical legal analysis require reconsidering laws from the point how much and whether at all they open the space for addressing gender-based inequalities and their overcoming. Feminist legal analysis also require reconsidering interpretations of laws and implementation of laws from gender-sensitive and gender-competent perspective. In other words, gender-sensitive legal analysis has its focus on overcoming of gender-based and intersectionally defined inequalities and oppression from the existent laws as such, as well as from their interpretation and implementation. In addition, feminist critical legal thought has been developing the so-called feminist judgment stream. It is contesting the particular case law and judicial decision-making from the gender equality perspective. So already done judicial legacy and case law being reconsidered, how it could or would or should look like if the decision-making and the whole judging process were taken from the point of gender equality and from this perspective. The second fundamental goal of feminist jurisprudence has been related to the pair oppression discrimination. McKinnon's analysis on male domination urged feminist legal scholars to focus on the legal structures of oppression rather than on specific rights-related discrimination. Differently from discrimination, oppression is produced in a systemic way, namely it operates through social, political, and economic systems that simultaneously limit women's opportunities and penalize them in different but inevitable ways. So in her opinion, and not only in hers, oppression as more complex and more encompassing concept and approach would be opted for. Additionally, oppression targets groups rather than individuals. Unlike discrimination, which can affect individuals as well as groups, oppression primarily involves groups, and individuals are affected by oppression because they belong to a particular group. The third center of focus of feminist legal critique has been the distinction between the public and private sphere, and here we have the overlapping, and I will not mention anything more, and just within this dichotomy and legal critiques approach to reconsidering dichotomy between private and public and considering of the private, comes the issue of reproductive rights. So that issue and right to abortion, they have the central, how to say, position within this private-public dichotomy analysis within the critical legal theories. And just to add and to finish with that the legal feminists, when speak about the right to abortion and the reproductive rights, accentuate that the debate on abortion does not exhaust the issues raised in the field of reproductive rights. I have already spoken how political theory, critical feminist political theories discuss this issue, but what do add critical legal theoreticians. So does not exhaust the issues raised in the field of reproductive rights because all women have to have access to welfare support for reproductive rights. Otherwise, many poor women cannot afford themselves to descend practicing the right to abortion, and also because this was already mentioned, but this wasn't. The rise in medical technologies has been accompanied by both an increased medicalization of reproductive issues and increased regulation of this field, where women's rights to exercise control over their bodies are placed in competition with the claims of the state, the husband, and the unborn. So all of these issues have been on agenda within critical legal theories. I will finish with this, and we have 5 minutes. Maybe somebody can put one question, or we will make this. We did not plan the break of 5 minutes, but whatever. Or we can proceed with your lecture immediately, and then we can have the bigger break of 20 minutes before the third lecture, if you agree, or just decide.
I'm absolutely fine with any of these choices. Miodraž, you're next. So.
Probably you should decide. If
Have 5 minutes break.
Okay, you need 5 minutes break. So it means that it was too condensed or too... Okay, so the theoretical...
no, they just need 5 minutes.
Yes,
break.
but theoretical... Okay, so now you have break.